Thank you everyone for coming. I'm honored by your presence. So I was asked to talk about art and politics in the 70s. And I'm a younger generation than AA, so I did a few things in Chile during the dictatorship. So I wanted to share that with you. It's work that's mostly unknown. And then I thought I would connect that to what I've been doing now, which is my work about immigration and refugees around the world and mostly in Europe. So I will connect it to what I'm doing here for Parcours. So let's have the lights off, please. The military coup in Chile occurred on September 11, 1973. I was 17 years old, and I was starting my studies of architecture that month. And I fell in love with what's something called lettres settes. Now it's a prehistoric object, but lettres settes are these plastic letters that you glue on boards. And one day I started playing with it. And I decided to write with white letters white numbers on a black background, the date of the coup, 11/09/73. And then I realized that it was not quite centered on that black piece of paper I had chosen. And so I decided to add the time of the first bomb on the presidential palace, 12:10. And then I saved it. And this became, without me knowing, my first work of art. This is 1974, and this is a pre-internet time. I didn't know anything about the art world. I was going to be an architect. But I kept it, and I'm happy I did. The next year, also in 74, I created a calendar where, if you look closely at the month of September and beyond, after September 11, every day is 11. Because that day changed my life and changed the life of my generation. We lived in a curfew for 17 years with censorship, with repression, with people disappearing. And so it changed everything for us. And so I created this calendar where after September 11, which was a Tuesday, every day became 11. Years later, looking at my notebooks from architecture studies, I discovered these pages where I had obsessively written down the number 11, 11, 11. I also became a magician. I wanted to change the world that had been given to me by the military coup. And for a few years, I dedicated myself to magic. But it didn't work. So I went back to architecture, and I started making art. My father was subscribed to many publications from around the world because of the censorship. And so we were reading French magazines, Spanish magazines, British magazines, and one day, in a French magazine, there was this reportage on Nicaragua. And I saw this extraordinary image by Susan Meiselas. And I was touched by this soldier playing a clarinet in the middle of this war zone. So I decided to do a performance. I recorded it on another prehistoric object, a Sony Betamax. And I titled it Opus 1981. The performance consisted in inhale deeply, exhale deeply in a clarinet, and repeat the process until total exhaustion. I lasted 7 minutes and 15 seconds. Today, the work is presented like this in an old monitor with the video and the original image and the cover of the tape. I make a very strange sound. We don't have sound now, but it's a very strange sound. And a friend of mine discovered years later that I was playing the clarinet in reverse because I didn't know how to play clarinet. But in this sound, I wanted to express everything that could not be said verbally because of the censorship. Here I was yelling, I was crying, I was expressing myself in the most subtle way because there was nothing else I could do. And if you're curious about the hairstyle, I can assure you it was very fashionable at the time. Opus 1981. Then I went out to the streets of Santiago and did a project called Studies on Happiness. And I did survey in the streets of Santiago. I wanted to ask people if they were happy or unhappy. I thought it was a philosophical question, and the government would let me free to do this. So these are some scenes of that survey. And I was offering people a shrimp gum and asking them either they can have it or they can vote. So this is the estimated percentage of happy people in Chile and in the world. And are you happy? Then I did some portraits of happy and unhappy people. This is a happy person number 31. And so they all answered a questionnaire and I did a photographic session with them. Or this is an unhappy person number 58. I also did public presentations of happy and unhappy people. So this is in an art center, and a friend of mine that declared himself unhappy would sit on a chair and the other one happy on the other chair. And I had interviewed them previously, and so we played the interviews on tape, so they remained silent. And there was a schedule for when people would appear on stage. And then I went out further and I started asking the entire population of Santiago, are you happy? And at the same time, I offered them a stage in the museum where I had set up a chair and a microphone and a small monitor where people were being recorded. So I did a portrait of happy and unhappy people in the 80s in Santiago de Chile. In these foreign magazines that we were getting, I was able to see scenes from the military coup. So I started clipping these images, mostly from French magazines. And what I did, I identified a face in that scene and I enlarged it on the same board. And I was thinking that by just looking at the expression of these faces, people would understand what a dictatorship is. This work is called Faces. This photograph was taken in the National Stadium where many people were detained and most of them were killed. If you look at this man's face, I think he knows he's going to die. The resignation, all these things we were feeling and we could not express verbally, I thought you could see them in those faces. So again, these photographs are clippings from newspapers and magazines, they're not mine. That little girl here in the crowd, she's lost behind 4 men on the right side. We don't see her, but by rescuing her face from that crowd and enlarging it, we can see her sadness in all its magnitude. Faces. Then I discovered that the military coup had been sponsored by the CIA and had been financed by Mr. Kissinger and Mr. Nixon. And I became obsessed with Kissinger, and I dedicated many works to Kissinger. These are postcards where I say, searching for Kissinger. In a recent retrospective about the early works, I created a vitrine with all the photographs that he included in his own biography. There were 2 volumes in 1983 and 1984, and I placed in these vitrines all the images included in those 2 books. And I circle in red his face. I'm searching for K. That's the title of the work. So he's shown all around the world talking with different heads of states. So people walk around these 3 vitrines and finding him everywhere. And I've added a 4th small vitrine with an image that has been framed. And this is the photograph that was not included in the biography. Is here with Pinochet. The Village Voice in New York did a story how you can arrest Henry Kissinger for war crimes by James Ridgway. I was delighted. I immediately appropriated the cover and it became a work of mine. Manhattan's Milosevic, it says. And I had a retrospective in Berlin on the anniversary of the coup. And I purchased ads in all 3 Berlin newspapers asking to arrest Kissinger. And we published them in all the 7 languages of all the countries where he committed war crimes. He's responsible for millions of people's death. Finally, 25 years later, I was invited by the president of Chile to create a memorial for the victims of the military coup. A museum of memory and human rights was created in Santiago. It's the green building. It's a striking building that is sitting on 2 reflecting pools. And I was asked to create a memorial somewhere in the square outside. And when I realized I could not compete with this striking building, I decided to go underground. So the memorial is here at the bottom left. And people is invited to either visit the memorial before or after visiting the museum, where the history of the dictatorship is told. For the memorial, you're invited to walk down 33 steps. The work is called La Geometría de la Conciencia, the geometry of conscience. And you reach a level minus 5 meters, and you will enter from the right and you will exit from the left. Once you enter, you are in a dark cubic space, which is 5 by 5 by 5 meters. It's all dark. And there is a guard that will welcome you and say, "Welcome to the geometry of the conscience. Please turn off your phone and remain silent. I will open the doors of the memorial for you." And when you enter, you are in full darkness for 60 seconds. 60 seconds of darkness and silence. After those 60 seconds, slowly, an image starts emerging from the back. And this image will go from 0% to 100% intensity. And it will grow and grow and grow up to blinding you. And as you get used to the light, you realize these are silhouettes, laser cut on a metal plate in the back of the memorial. This is the back wall. Half of them are victims of the Pinochet regime, people that we call los desaparecidos, the missing ones. And the other ones are people that is alive and that I photograph anonymously in the streets of Santiago. So here I'm mixing the living and the dead. I wanted to shift the design of the memorial to include the living. I had realized in my research that most memorials bury the victims as if we're going to get rid of them. Here I wanted them not to be alone, to be together with the living people. So this is a laser cut, and we have a white plexi, and behind we have a complex amount of LED lighting controlled by a computer. These are the faces of some of the people that were killed, like Dignaldo Erminio Araneda Pizzini. And with a very simple system, we created the outline and we removed the face. And we did the same with Jenny and Luis, Santiago, Elizabeth, Hector, Jorge, Elsa, Rafael, Antonio, Marta, Jacqueline, Maria, Victor, Raúl. And when people get used to this blinding light coming from the silhouette, they realize there are two mirrors on the side, and the mirrors create an infinite projection of these faces. Because I wanted to create a memorial for 17 million people and not only for those victims and their families. I wanted to suggest a collective narrative where we all lost something, and to illuminate those visitors with the light coming from the living and the dead. And then suddenly the lights go off for another 30 seconds. But this time it's not darkness. Because of the after image effect, people can still see these silhouettes in their brain, and they will leave when the doors open with them. The geometry of conscience in Santiago. These are some of the images that we have seen on our screens in the last 12 months. Most of them are intolerable. And people start talking about a new immigration crisis. But it wasn't new. It's just that now we have mostly white faces. Before we had black faces, and those faces were coming to the south, to Greece, to Italy, to Spain. This is Lampedusa, an island that belongs to Italy, where 15,000 people are practically in prison waiting for a destiny. And this is the image of Lampedusa that Italian authorities would prefer to give. I've done many projects about immigration in Europe, and I would like to finish with one I did in Finland. And then I would like to talk about what I'm doing for Parcours. This is Helsinki. It's a very beautiful city where some ugly scenes have been seen lately in the streets. A few years ago, I was invited to do a public project, and in my research, I quickly discovered how homogeneous is a Finnish society. When I looked at the numbers, I discovered that while Sweden, Denmark, and Norway had welcomed 1 million immigrants in the last 10 years, Finland had welcomed 37. they have a very restrictive immigration policy, and one explanation is that because they have been conquered by the Swedes and the Russians for 600 years. But when I was starting my project, Finland wanted to become a member of the European Union. And I thought that was an extraordinary contradiction, to close your doors to members of other communities and wanted, as a country, to enter a different community, the EU. And so I created a project to respond to that reality. I sought for legal help from this man, lawyer, Matti Vuori, a human rights lawyer who helped me to gather the information and fight legally for my project. So after 6 months with the discussion with the Finnish Immigration Authority, I was able to produce my work, which was called 1 million Finnish passports. And that's exactly what we have here. They requested by contract that I display them behind high security glass. I accepted. They also asked me to burn them after the exhibition without any witnessing, photography or filming. I also accepted. Why 1 million passports? I had calculated that most European countries have approximately 20% of their populations as foreigners or people of foreign descent. Since Finland has 5 million inhabitants, if Finland had a normal immigration policy like its European neighbors, they should have had 1 million immigrants. These are their passports. With this very simple gesture, I wanted to ask the people of Finland, do you want to remain insular, or do you want to welcome new faces, new ideas, new sounds? We lit the work in a very subtle way. I wanted people to see themselves reflected on the glass and through their own image to see the passports. My objective was achieved when we made the front pages of all the newspapers and magazines, and a healthy discussion about immigration was triggered in the media. But the most beautiful reaction, the most moving one, was that a young man came to see the exhibition. He was moved. He went back home and came back in the afternoon with his own passport and threw it on top of the pile as a sign of solidarity. We had to burn the passport at the end of the exhibition, unfortunately, but I managed to steal 200. And I still don't know what to do with them. 1 million Finnish passports in Helsinki. This image is probably the one that changed the world in terms of a new awareness about immigration in Europe and in the world. And I'd like to show you the story of that image because I'm interested in the politics of images. And the work I'm doing for Parcours is based on this image. This is the one we know, but this is the original image taken by a Turkish photographer, a woman, for a Turkish agency. As you can see, it's a very complex image with the photographer, 2 men fishing, a road, 2 cars. And when the editor of The Independent in London saw it, he immediately purchased the rights and did this. 1, 2, 3, and 4. And this, somebody's child on the cover of The Independent. And that made the difference. It went viral all around the world. And something incredible happened. Mind shifted. The Daily Mirror had this image and this title, Unbearable, on the cover. The same Daily Mirror in London that a few weeks before had these kinds of covers. The same happened with Daily Mail. Tiny victim of a human catastrophe, they say. This is what they said a few months before. The swarm on our streets, quoting David Cameron. Or migrants, how many more can we take, they ask. This is the same paper a few months before. Le Monde had an editorial about this image on the cover. Libération had six pages dedicated to this image and 2 pages analyzing the image. An image, a turning point. And another editorial, why we did not publish earlier the photograph by Ireland. La Stampa had probably the most beautiful and poetic text about this image. La spiaggia su cui muore l'Europa, by Mario Calabresi. And I'm quoting Mario Calabresi in the work that I've done for Parcours. The image also went viral in social media. How his story should have ended, says Steve Dennis. Come with us, dear refugees, we will take you to the land of safety. Please let our bodies go to the shore to open the eyes of the world. Mama, am I going to drown in the sea like Aylan? You're so lucky, Aylan. We are victims of the same war, but nobody cared about our death. This is an Indian artist in Delhi. This is a performance group in Morocco. This is a school in the Gaza Strip in Palestine. This is a graffiti in Sao Paulo, Brazil. And this is a fellow artist, Ai Weiwei, imitating the body of Aylan Kurdi on that same beach. My work is dedicated to MOAS, Migrant Offshore Aid Station. It's an extraordinary young NGO, non-government organization, who does something very special and quite unique. They send drones to the high seas. Those drones that now are killing people in Yemen, in Afghanistan, in Iraq. These killing machines have killed more than 10,000 people in the last 10 years, in complete invisibility. Women, children, innocent people, because they were suspected of being terrorists. Here, MOAS has turned things around, and these machines are looking at people in the high seas. And when they see a boat in distress, they send their own boats, and they rescue them before they sink and before they drown. So that's why my project is dedicated to raise funds for MOAS. And so what we did, we manipulated all these images that we found about this young victim, 3-year-old. His name was reported as Aylan Kurdi by the media, but his real name is Alan Shenu, without Y. So we manipulate digitally the sea and the sand, and we created an image of the complete sea. And of course, we removed the body. I did not want to show you that image again. And so this is the gift we are being offering all around Parcours, hoping that as an answer, as a response to this gift, some people might be moved and touch and help MOAS to rescue more people. And the coincidence right now is that we are distributing 12,000 boxes, and it's exactly the same number, maybe a little less than the numbers that MOAS has saved thanks to their operations. Thank you.
I've elected, can you hear me? I've elected not to give a presentation because I think if we're going to have a conversation, that's about 500% more information than we need to have a conversation. So let's start from there.
Well, shortly before I came to Basel, I was in Manifesto looking at a work by the American artist Lila Dare, which documents a group therapy session for a group of Swiss people. And they were discussing how one of the people in the session had really upset another person, and this had upset the whole group. And the person who started the whole upset said that she thought that the problem with Switzerland and Swiss people, I mean, as if there could be any problems, was that they're always afraid of provoking people. And I think some of the works you've shown really provoke an emotional engagement. And I know a lot of your work also does this. And I was wondering what role provoking people plays in your work and how much that's something you set out to do when you make a work of art.
I was brought up with an English mother and a Canadian father and in a very British household. And I was always taught that at the dinner table, to be polite if there was company, you should always take the opposite point of view to theirs. That you couldn't have good conversation without being provocative. And so that's always been how I've lived my life. Unfortunately, it's been in my 28 years in New York, this was never considered normal behavior. And it wasn't popular behavior, but that's, I think, in a way, that childhood upbringing is the key to how I've worked.
In my case, I'm not thinking about provocation at all. I'm an architect, and I design each project, and I give myself a program and an objective. And so depending on the issue I'm dealing with, depending on the context I'm working with, this objective might be provocation or might be something else. So it really depends on the objective of the specific project. But yes, sometimes, of course, provocation might be part of the objective.
And it was interesting in your presentation how much you showed us images of print media. And I know, AA, that's something that you've used a lot and been a pioneer of, with File and with General Idea, and with the New York Art Book Fair and Metropole. So I wonder if you could talk about the ways that you've used print media, particularly during the 70s maybe, and how you're a pioneer of that form of artwork.
I'm not sure what to say exactly. I mean, I started using print media in university in 65, 66. And of course, that was an era when Canada, was kind of the opposite situation of Alfredo, in that Canada was an extremely left-wing country, extremely liberal. Gays in the military were legalized in 1968. I always use that as a statistic that quite vividly illustrates how different it was, for example, from the US. And we were very lucky in the 60s in that we received an enormous influx of American draft dodgers because of the Vietnam War. And these people tended to be the most highly educated and the most intelligent of the American population. So I really think the best of the Americans are now all Canadians. And in the mid-60s, there was something invented called the web offset press, which was just a conventional, what we think of now as a conventional newspaper press. But prior to that, newspapers had to be printed in enormous quantities. And with the web offset press, you could suddenly print 1,000 copies. You didn't have to print 50,000. And this gave rise to the underground newspaper. And underground newspapers were spawned all over the world. I had dropped out of university in 67, 68, somewhere around there, with 8 friends, and we had founded a commune, a free school, and an underground newspaper. And I became very active in the world of what we then called radical education, mainly going to conferences and speaking at conferences, and then also with the commune movement. And the underground newspaper, which was called the Loving Couch Press, was in a way our voice to discuss those things. And also there was It's the first time I became aware of the idea of a network. These underground newspapers were very much in touch with each other across Europe, across North America, and down to Australia and New Zealand. Information was exchanged in a very kind of internet-ish kind of way, although it was mostly by mail. So that's how I began in print media, really. Of course, pamphleteering was always a political act. The whole idea of publishing in small consumable things in small editions that could be given away is already a political act in its own history. When I moved to Toronto in 68, I think it was, 68, 69, I moved there because of a place called Rochdale College, which at that point was the biggest commune in the world. It was a 15-story brand new building, and each floor had a different community living in it. For example, the 15th floor looked like a kind of regular hippie community you might see somewhere. The 13th floor was a commune of witches, and the Hells Angels lived on another floor, and it was a very diverse kind of building. And part of that college was a place called the Coach House Press, which still exists today, a small press, very, very involved with poetry mostly, Allen Ginsberg, people like that, but also with kind of random radical acts of publishing. For example, they published a book which was called Clear, Pink, Blue, and it consisted of clear, white, pink, blue, 4 pieces of paper, a clear cover, a white page, a pink page, and a blue page. And there was no type on it anywhere. There was a tiny, tiny little emblem on the back that said, printed in Toronto by mindless acid freaks or something like that. And the secret to this book was that it had a tab of acid embedded in the white sheet of paper. And these were distributed free. And now, of course, it's extremely collectible because it's virtually impossible to find. So this was, in its way, a kind of political act within the social conformity of post-war Canada. When General Idea started, we were immediately involved with publishing projects of various kinds. But in '72, we began File magazine. And File magazine was essentially just an underground newspaper, one of these very, very cheap web offset press outputs with a cover wrapped around it to make it look like a magazine. And it was designed to look like Life magazine because we felt that it could act as a kind of parasite within the distribution system, and people would pick it up just because of its kind of air of familiarity. So it was a kind of appropriation, but appropriation of a format. My history in publishing goes on, so I should probably stop with File, but File probably establishes the pattern. I will say in '74 we established Art Metropole, which has a stand here at the fair this year and every year. And Art Metropole we set up as a kind of distribution center and an archive for artist publications because these publications had started to proliferate to such an extent. And I'll add another thing, and that is that in particular we were getting huge volumes of small, modest artist publications from Eastern Europe and from Latin America. And the reason was because these small publications allowed for a kind of political act without being necessarily found out by the police or whoever. So there's in various countries, including Mexico and also various countries in South America, there were very, very active artists publishing pamphlets and also behind the Iron Curtain, as we called it then. So we developed a very fine collection of political pamphleteering from the 60s and 70s.
A lot of your work has its origins at the beginning in communal living and the idea of community. And even the project you have here is a collaboration. And I think also, Alfredo, with your parkour project, there's this idea of creating a community with a shared interest. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about how community and the audience and working with other people plays a role in both of your work?
Well, I think most of the things we do, we cannot do them alone. And so to build a community is a key aspect of most of the projects we have to do. Because an important aspect of every project is communication. And in order to communicate, we have to create a language that creates and invent a vocabulary for that. And the easiest way to do that is through a community. Because when we are alone and we try to communicate to a large audience, then we face many challenges that sometimes are very difficult to overcome. So the larger the community, the larger is the focus, and the objective becomes common. And so I've done different projects in communities, and I like to engage people in that conversation through a community-based situation. This is also a way for me not to feel alone doing this project, but try to try out these ideas, to communicate them, and as I realize that there are members of the community that are sympathetic to the idea, then the community grows and the message grows.
I mean, you were talking about receiving lots of other publications and how your work had started a dialogue, and is that something you had in mind or something that happened? And you almost described it as a sort of pre-internet.
Well, being Canadians and being in Toronto, we were, disciples of Marshall McLuhan. And a lot of our thinking was around the idea of communication and media and networks, which was a funny word at the time. It didn't have the same meaning it has now. So yeah, I was all very intentional. I mean, what we wanted to do. I mean, we became very involved in so-called mail art in 1970, 71, 72. And that, again, was a kind of almost like a study for the internet, or for email, or for Tumblr blogs or something. Actually, Tumblr blogs is probably the closest thing. People would send themselves each other images in the mail, and there was a vast amount of material from the mass media flowing through the mails between artists.
I mean, I think the internet's coming up a little bit now, and I noticed, Alfredo, in your presentation, you felt initially, when you were talking about the work in Santiago, obliged to say that this was before the internet, and then you got these pictures. And you ended the presentation with pictures of print newspapers. So I wonder how much the internet has changed your approach, both to how you make the work and how the work reaches out to the world.
Yeah, I'm obsessed with the news media, and I'm a news junkie. I start every day of my life spending between 1 and 2 hours looking at the media. I'm interested in the construction of ideology through media and through images, and it's fascinating how the same news, the same event is reported by the media depending on the ideological context, the ideological framework, how this image is used and how this image is credited and so on. So I'm fascinated by this, what I call the politics of images. And I think this interest was intensified in Chile because of the censorship, because we were obsessed, we couldn't know what was going on. And so to try to reach information from the outside was also a way for us to understand what was happening around us and in the world. I don't think the internet has changed greatly the situation. We just have more images circulating in different formats. Maybe we have easier access, but it creates an enormous amount of confusion at the same time. And the larger problem I think we face is that we haven't been taught how to read images, because images are not innocent. Every image out there that seems innocent is really is a container for information. Every image contains a conception of the world, and we are being sold ideas, we are being sold products through these images that seem so innocent. And so we have to be able to translate these images and to try to understand what they are trying to tell us. And we have been taught as children how to read, but not how to see. And I've faced that issue from the beginning, so that's why I became obsessed with with working with the images and trying to understand how the media functions. Yeah.
I mean, you talked about how a printing press revolutionized your work, Offset. Does the internet changed it at all? How you operate?
Well, in a way, no. I still operate the same way. But every technology brings changes. So, for example, the plain paper copier, which was released in 75, 76, resulted in the explosion of punk zines in 77, which then generalized into a sea of zine publishing, which is now still very much with us. And the various technologies followed that one. I guess digital printing being the current one in the world of print. I find it very interesting how artists take over these various new media as they appear. Oh, hi there. I've just been, Katrina Sieverding, I just was recently remembering riding with you on a train to Capri, down the coast of Italy, and how you managed to go the whole way without ever buying a ticket, by flirting outrageously with the conductors. Excuse me for that aside, I had to say it. And hiding in the washrooms. In about 77 or something like this. Sorry. But speaking of media, I moved to Berlin 3 years ago, and we went into the Deutsche Bank to open a bank account. And there, behind the counter, was a portrait of you. And we said to, oh, Katrina Sieverding, we know Katrina, I know Katrina Sieverding. And they said, oh yes, we have a wonderful collection. We love Katrina Sieverding. And so I thought, well, that must be the right bank to be in. So media and art too, I think, has a kind of power that we don't always expect in places like banks. Excuse me.
It's okay. It's wonderful that you're subverting the talk as well. I want to return briefly to this idea of politics and art, and whether, when you're making a work, you say this is going to be a political piece of art, or whether politics is something that happens to you after you've responded to a context or a situation.
I think that politics is everywhere. There is no question about it. I think that there is no way to produce anything, an idea, an object, a film, a dance, a performance, a sculpture. Everything we do contains a conception of the world. And it can be read politically and ideologically. So I think we should just accept this and be aware of that. So everything we do has a political dimension. I like always to quote Jean-Luc Godard, who said that it might be true that you have to choose between ethics or aesthetics, but it is also true that whichever one you choose, you will always find the other one at the end of the road. And I think it is a reality that we have to face. Everything we do has a political dimension and can be translated in political terms. So I'm not thinking at all, let's say, am I doing something political or not? Not. Everything I do has a clear objective and it has a political dimension.
And for you?
Well, as a Canadian, growing up in a very enlightened political situation, it was almost as if politics didn't exist. And it was more like the social existed. I mean, human justice issues existed, but because, well, also, it's Canada's a small country, so if you phone your member of parliament's office, you can probably talk to your member of parliament. Whereas in the US, if you phone a politician's office, you'll get a recorded announcement. And so there's a very different feeling about the role of government and the role of politics in the life of the nation. It's much more integrated, and you have much more the feeling as an individual of being part of the government, whereas in Alfredo's situation, of course, it was the total opposite. So that made, in a way, politics kind of invisible because it was just part of the process of living in what was basically a social democracy. And it was human rights and social justice. I mean, Canada in the early 60s, I think 64, retired 2/3 of its military, and the remaining third from then on until not so long ago only acted in peace missions, mostly with the United Nations. So it became a military devoted to peace. So it's, it's a different kind of country than many other countries. And politics was behind this, it was just present, but it wasn't, there were always people disagreeing with people, and the Canadian Parliament, like the British Parliament, is just one big fight and people shouting at each other, but that's kind of the excitement and fun of it. Vietnam for us was an issue, but it wasn't a political issue because we were Canadians. It was a social justice issue. And of course, we've had our own social justice issues that we've ignored, such as the state of our Aboriginal people. But everything comes down in a way to that. So to leap into a completely different part of my history, at the age of 60, I went back to school to study at Union Theological Seminary. And because I realized the one religion I knew nothing about was Christianity, and I have many generations of clergy in my family, so I thought maybe I should find out a little bit about Christianity before I die. And when I was there, I discovered it was very much like the art world. There was a lot of, it was a very particular kind of seminary, kind of feminist. A lot of, about 2/3 of the students are women, which is pretty much unheard of in a seminary, especially a lot of Roman Catholic women, because they can't go to a Roman Catholic seminary. And it was, there was a lot of interest. It was about 1/3 black. There was a lot of interest in black liberation theology, queer theology, feminist theology, and so on. And I started an organization called the Institute for Art, Religion, and Social Justice. And it never occurred to me to include the word politics in the title, because that's just not in my brain. And in fact, Alfredo came and gave a talk at the seminary. A lot of artists, Marina Abramovich, Kara Walker, etc., came, and Greg Bordowitz came and gave talks at the seminary, and it was very interesting because normally the worlds of Christianity and art, keep on opposite sides of the room. So I'm not sure if I answered you or not. But
I think so. Also led us to the next question, which is how exactly do art, religion, and social justice work together? And can art be something that can help achieve social justice, or does it simply become a representation of a certain set of ideals? And I think this also applies to Alfredo as well, in terms of what are the real consequences that an artwork can have on things.
Well, the word religion is the troubling word in those three, art, religion, and social justice. And I included it almost as a way of being provocative. They had a department of, what did they call it, art and theology or something like that, in the seminary. And this consisted mostly of experimenting, in quotation marks, with things like dancers running down the aisle in a church service with white pieces of fabric or something. This was their idea of how art could be incorporated into religion. But that wasn't what I had in mind, and so I began this conversation that was more about social justice.
I truly believe that art and culture can affect change. I think culture is our most precious capital. That's actually the title of a recent work of mine, where I simply spell out culture equal capital. Imagine for a second a world without culture. Imagine a world without music, without literature, without film, without dance, without theater. We would not be able to breathe. In 1962, an American writer wrote a book called The Man. It was an extraordinary book. It made quite an impact. And 10 years later, a film was made based on this book. And that film also was incredibly successful. So then other films were made based on that film called The Man. And then all the books were written following the same plot of that novel. And then musicians started singing about the man and rapping about the man. And then a TV series was written about the plot of the man. And what was the plot? The plot in 1962 imagined a black president in the United States. It was completely unheard of. And that idea grew out of that book. And the world of culture embraced it. And for the next 50 years, it was absolutely normal to find a black president on our TV screens or on a cinema screens, or listening to musicians talking about this idea. Culture invented Obama and made it possible. After these 50 years where culture created the possibility of a black president, he was elected. I truly believe that culture made it possible because it eliminated the threat that existed in the air in a very still racist country like the United States. It became normal. So that's what culture does. Sometimes it is very slow, but culture definitely can affect change. As Nietzsche said, without music, life would be a mistake.
Has that also been your experience? That maybe works you produced earlier on, the issues that they tackled have been transformed in a positive way?
No, I think, it's always 2 steps forward, 1 step back. I'm not, I'm probably more cynical about all of this. I'm not sure how much change there actually is in the end. We could have change for 50 years or 100 years, and then suddenly, if you look at the U.S. today, it's kind of scary. Very scary moment in American history. So I don't know. I think culture, though, culture is what people are. People are culture. Culture is what people are about. And without culture, you don't have humanity. And that's already a radical act. Culture is already radical by making humanity the baseline of our lives. And I'm sorry to return to Katrina again, but I wanted to clarify that you managed to avoid pain with such joy and abandon, and you brought such smiles to all the faces of all the conductors. It was really a kind of performance art, and it's something I've never forgotten. Is this kind of a radical act of a kind of an air of happy freedom that kind of activated the entire train, brought everybody into alignment with you. It was really, really like an amazing, amazing ride. So I'll use that as an example of how art and culture and the artist can affect the environment and the society.
One of the things I noticed in terms of both your biographies is that you trained as an architect and you studied architecture as opposed to art.
I trained as an architect.
Yeah. And also latterly in theology studies. I just wonder if having started in architecture affects your work and how you approach problems in a different way, or if it's still something that stays with you as opposed to maybe a more conventional art training.
Yeah, I'm very thankful to architecture and that I didn't study art. Architecture changed my life. Everything I know, it's because I'm an architect and an artist thanks to an architect. I use the methodology of the architect to make art, and for the architect, context is everything. For an architect, a space is not just a physical space, it's also a social space, a political space, a cultural space. For an architect, it's unthinkable to start thinking about a project without knowing where the sun is coming from. these are very basic things about the context that we need to understand before acting. And so thanks to architecture, I created my own motto, which is, I will not act in the world before understanding the world. And so that's what I do. And so all the work I do is based on research, and this research is based on architecture. Trying to understand the context, trying to understand the program, trying to understand the objective, and then create the work after that. And I will not act before understanding, before feeling responsible for the context in which I'm acting. And all this is coming from architecture.
Well, I think my husband, who is an architect, would say I learned nothing from studying architecture.
I think anyone who sees your work in here would disagree with that.
Well, there is a thing about totality, about working with many different parts and many different systems which come together in some other kind of way. And in that sense, I work with some similarity to the architect. However, in second year architecture, we had a drawing class. We were drawing buildings. And the teacher was from the art school next door. And we put all our drawings up anonymously. None of them were signed. And I had chosen to draw the spaces between the buildings rather than the buildings themselves. Of course, always being the bad boy. And he looked at those drawings and he said, I don't know whose drawings these are, but you'll never be happy in architecture and you should move over to the building next door immediately. But I didn't. I dropped out and formed a commune instead. Architecture, I tend not to think so much in terms of disciplines, architecture, art, or whatever. I have noted that many artists, many fine artists of my generation either studied philosophy or architecture, certainly not fine art. And I'm always a bit alarmed at this movement towards masters and PhDs and so on of fine arts. I don't really get what it's all about. Every now and then I get an honorary doctorate, and then I get to say to the art students that I don't really understand why they're studying, because it's so much easier to get an honorary one. Why not, why not do it that way instead? Costs less, too, if you're in North America.
I guess for myself, I notice, the experience of a lot of your more recent works is this very generous space that invites a community to assemble in some ways within it. And I wonder if that is a way of thinking that relates a little bit to that architecture background.
Maybe because, it's about communities of people. So when I started both the New York Art Book Fair and the LA Art Book Fair, I assembled them in a way architecturally, as one does an art fair. It's a matter of booths and who you're going to put next to whom and all that kind of thing. But I really tried to think of who are the communities in the larger book community, and how do you assemble them in a way that there starts to be a different kind of interaction, and so it was a kind of architectural problem to form. But then once the people come in the door, you realize it's not really an architectural problem, it's a social problem, and the problem we had solved was a social problem, although we had done it through the architecture of the space. Yeah, I think in a way there's art, as there's politics and everything, there's architecture and everything.
I think A.A. is being very modest. He's an architect too. If you look at his work here, it's pure architecture, and architecture is not about buildings, it's about bodies moving in that space and creating relations and scales between those bodies moving in that space. So in that sense, I'm sure Mark would agree that it's pure architecture, and it's the architecture that facilitates and that's made possible, and that creates the context for the work of AA. So I think it's being very modest. It's pure architecture.
Well, and then I'll have to point out that the red and white tent is designed by Mark, not by me, and made by him. But it's true, the overall concept of is based on the movement of bodies. This boardwalk is trying to, in a way, echo a cloister, or the Buddhists walking around the bells in the temple, or all the other kind of circular formations that humanity takes when it moves is kind of, the piece kind of forces you into this meditative movement.
It almost feels like a progress, an old-fashioned pilgrim's progress. I'm going to ask you one last question before throwing things open to questions from the floor. In both of the ways in which you talk about your early work, I mean, Alfredo, you're very obviously responding to a context in Santiago, and you've mentioned responding to context in Canada, or within your proximity with living with other people, with what's going on in the world around you. I wonder if there's a difference in the way you work when you're stepping outside your immediate surroundings, or if you're going to make a project on Africa, for instance. Does that change how you approach things?
Well, as I explained, for me, context is everything. So when I do a project in a place far from home, the process is very similar. I need to understand it. I need to understand it. And my research projects have lasted between 2 and 6 years. For example, when I created work around the Rwandan genocide, and I had to work 6 years around this in order to understand the context before acting. And so for me, it's very important to understand, to research, to understand, to research. And only when I feel responsible, when I've reached a critical level of information that makes me feel responsible and that I can venture to formulate ideas and speculations, then I act. So again, context is everything, and I need to understand before acting. So I would say that I use the same approach and methodology everywhere.
And for you, how does that work? I mean, is it different to produce a work, say, in Korea than it is back in the day in Toronto?
Well, yes and no. I mean, I'm very interested in various spiritual practices. So if I do it, for example, the project in Korea, I did a lot of research into Korean shamanism, and the main herb that I used, bifus or mugwort in English, is the same herb I'm using here. That is the primary herb that's used in Korean shamanism, for example. So I do research, but I tend to be a kind of more of a dilettante about it than Alfredo is, and I pull in people and relationships, and it's more through collaboration. So I don't feel that I have to be the expert. A lot of my performances have been from a series called Invocation of the Queer Spirits. And for those performances, I've invoked the spirits of the dead marginalized communities from that place, everything from perhaps HIV and AIDS deaths in the recent past through to, for example, in New Orleans, populations of slaves. But to do that, I have to be involved with the local people. It's all about collaboration for me always.
And that sort of reminded me, I did want to ask you one last question, which was the magic and the magician. Where did that go wrong, or why did you stop doing it? And is that still something you involve in your work in any way?
I think magic never left me, and I'm always thinking about magic when I create a work, because I want to surprise people, I want to inform them, I want to move them, I want them to react. So I think I'm still a magician in a way, even though it's not quite obvious. And but it was very important for me, because I was a very shy kid, and my father encouraged me to be a magician in order to get rid of the shyness, and it helped me a lot.
Great. Are there any questions from the audience? There's one right in the middle. I think there's a microphone coming your way. Other side. Other side.
First of all, Alfredo, it's really inspirational, all your work, and as a former refugee from Baku, I'm Armenian. I'm particularly touched by all of these things. My question is this is a little bit desperate, you know, now that I live in France and everything is fine, etc. But, you know, what do we do with all of that, you know? Is there any proposal how to treat this problem? You know, we as citizens of fantastic countries with nice GDP per capita.
Well, you know, I don't have a solution. I just want to recuperate some of our lost humanity. We are being less humans when we are reacting in such a way. And I've been shocked at the lack of response of Europe, besides the exception of Germany, perhaps. And there's so much we can do, and I decided to focus on the work of MOAS because I felt it's the most urgent thing we have to do first, which is to rescue these people before they sink, they drown. But I really do not have answers. Basically, I think we have to rethink about our lives and change, basically change. Europe is panicking for about 1.5 million people, which represent 0.03% of their population. That's what they're panicking about. And at the same time, already, more than 2.5 million people is refugee in Turkey, or 1.5 in Lebanon, or 1.5 in Jordan. So those three countries have accepted almost 5 million people. And we don't even hear about it. And Europe, which is extremely wealthy, is panicking for 1.5 million. I think that, you know, a lot of thinking has to be done, but we must resolve the immediate urgent situation, which is to save these people from drowning. It's unacceptable that people die because they're trying to reach a better place to live. It's unacceptable. And so we first have to resolve that situation, and that's what MOAS is doing, and other NGOs. And then I think, you know, some kind of think tank has to be created within Europe and take decisions and be generous and be open. If you think about it, we're all immigrants. We're all immigrants.
Hey, I'd now like to ask you, do you think of yourself as a solutions man when you're making work?
As a what?
Solutions.
Solution?
Yeah, in the sense that Alfredo was saying that he's not offering solutions to problems, but do you feel that you do in your work?
No, not at all. I don't even understand the concept.
There's a question over there on the left.
Thank you both for your responses. The question is geared towards AA, and also a selfish one, I guess, because I'm trying to further my understanding of the work there. So I was walking around on the sort of boardwalk, and while you were talking about it just now, you mentioned that it sort of references this kind of cloister environment, but moreover this type of circularity, right, in the movement. But for me, you know, if you are sort of a body walking there, it's actually very rectangular, right? So it exists also as a frame for me. And I was wondering, this is a mere sort of observation that I also felt sort of in the body, that I wasn't walking a circle, but really like a rectangular, and thus framing something. Can you talk a bit about that circularity, which is also, of course, like a theological argument vis-a-vis this sort of rectangularity and the act of framing something that is within that space of the boardwalk?
Well, you'll notice, like, a cloister is a rectangle, actually, not a circle. And the same with almost any example you can find of in religion, it's usually a rectangle, in fact. But it's always spoken about as a kind of, because it's continuous movement, I guess, as a circular movement. But that piece is also modeled after a Japanese rock garden. So it's also by framing, you can think of it that way too, as by framing it becomes an act of contemplation. But then I also think of it as a little bit like Fire Island. with its boardwalks, which is a gay holiday destination with boardwalks and wild deer, and it has a bit of echo of that too. So it's not intended to be any one thing, but it has many layers within it. That hasn't really answered your question, but the circle as a theological topic, I'm not sure that I'm the right person to address that.
Are there any more questions? No? But I'd really like to thank all of you for coming so early for this talk, and in particular to Alfredo and AA for being here with us and sharing what I think have been quite valuable insights into their work, and the ways in which art can operate within the world and its potentials for that. Thank you so much, both of you. And one last thing is, I think as you leave, you'll be getting a gift from Alfredo. So make sure you pick one up. Thank you.